Here's something that reveals how NIST really thinks. Of the 4 functions in the framework, 3 are about your AI systems. Only one is about your organization. And that one, govern, isn't placed first in a sequence. It's placed at the center, wrapped around the other 3, touching every one of them. NIST is telling you something with that geometry. Your biggest AI risk isn't a model, it's how your organization makes decisions about models. So let me ask you a question. When an AI system in your organization causes harm, where does the real failure usually sit? Not in the code most of the time. It sits in a governance gap. Nobody owned it. No policy covered it. No one had authority to stop it. The model just did what a poorly governed process allowed it to do. In this chapter, we build the governance layer. You learn why govern is cross-cutting rather than sequential, how to structure roles and oversight, how policy actually works when it's more than a document, and how the board fits in. We'll cover risk strategy, appetite and tolerance statements, workforce planning, third-party and supply chain risk, and the specific requirement NIST calls out around legal and regulatory compliance. And we'll finish on culture, which is the part you can't buy. Let's build the foundation everything else stands on. So let's start with the geometry because it tells you everything. Picture the NIST diagram. Map, measure, and manage sit in a row, and govern sits underneath and around all 3. It's not a fourth step, it's the ground the other 3 stand on. Why did they draw it that way? Because governance isn't a phase you complete. It's present in every other activity. Let me make that concrete. When you're mapping a system's context, who decided which stakeholders count? Governance. When you're measuring, who set the threshold that says this score is acceptable? Governance. When you're managing a risk, who has authority to accept it or to halt the project? Governance. See how it's woven through? Every one of the other functions contains a decision, and governance is where decisions get their authority. Here's the failure I see when people get this wrong. They treat govern as chapter 1 of a project. Write the policy, appoint the committee, tick it off, move on to the real work. And then 6 months later, a team hits a genuine risk decision and there's no live governance to make it. The governance was an event, not a condition. So the reframe. Govern isn't something you did. It's something that's always running, quietly deciding who's allowed to decide. Build it as a permanent layer, not a launch task. So let's talk structure, and I want to steer you between the 2 failure modes because organizations reliably fall into one or the other. Failure mode 1. Nobody owns AI risk. It's assumed to be someone else's job. IT thinks it's a business problem, the business thinks it's a technical problem, and the risk lives in the gap between them, unowned, until it becomes an incident. Failure mode 2, which looks responsible but isn't. Everybody owns it. There's a committee, there's a working group, there's a forum, and because everyone is accountable, no one is. Diffuse ownership is just unowned with more meetings. So what works? A few principles from what I've seen actually function. 1. A clear escalation path with a named owner at each level. Not a team, a person for each decision type. 2. Separation between building and assuring. The team that builds the model should not be the only team that signs off its risk. That's marking your own homework. 3. A bridge role. Someone who genuinely speaks both model and risk. This role is rare, hard to hire, and worth more than a large committee. Here's the honest bit. You don't need a huge structure. A small firm might have 3 named people. You need clarity, not headcount. So the question is, for each AI decision, is there one name? So let's talk policy, and I'll start with a provocation. Most AI policies are useless. Not wrong, useless, because they change nothing about what anyone actually does. Here's the test I apply. Read the policy, then ask, what would someone do differently tomorrow because this exists? If the honest answer is nothing, you have a document, not a policy. A useless policy says things like, AI shall be used responsibly and ethically. Lovely. Unfalsifiable. Nobody can violate it and nobody is guided by it. A real policy is specific and it bites. It says any AI system making decisions about individuals must be assessed at this level before deployment. It says models above this risk tier require a named human owner and sign off from this role. It says here is the threshold at which a model is pulled from production. Those are things people can actually follow and actually breach. And a policy needs teeth and a home. Who enforces it? What happens when it's ignored? Where does it live? And who keeps it current? A policy written once and never revisited is dead within a year because AI moves faster than that. I worked with a client whose AI policy was genuinely excellent and completely ignored because nobody had connected it to the actual deployment process. The gate existed on paper and not in the pipeline. So the rule: a policy is real only when it's wired into how work actually happens. So let's talk about the top of the house, because AI governance fails at the board level in a very particular way. Here's the failure. The board is shown a dashboard. Green, green, green. They nod. They note it. They move to the next agenda item. Everyone feels governed and nobody is. The problem is that the board often lacks the expertise to know what questions to ask, so they accept the answers they're given. And the people giving the answers have every incentive to make things look fine. So what should the board actually do? Not become AI experts, that's unrealistic. But do a few things well. Set the appetite. This is genuinely a board decision. What lines will this organization not cross with AI, whatever the commercial upside? That's them, not the technical team. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Not is it green? Instead, what's our worst case? What don't we know? What would have to be true for this to blow up? A board that asks what could go wrong changes the whole tenor of what gets reported. Ensure accountability exists. Is there a named owner? Do they have authority and resource? And ensure they themselves are informed enough to challenge. That might mean training or an independent advisor. So the shift I'd push for: move the board conversation from reviewing green dashboards to probing worst cases. That single change surfaces more real risk than any report. So let's talk strategy, because there's a difference between doing governance activities and having a governance strategy, and the gap matters. Activities without strategy looks like this. You assess models, you write policies, you hold meetings, lots of motion. But ask, what are we actually trying to achieve and by when? And you get blank looks. You're busy, not directed. A strategy answers the harder questions. What's our AI risk posture? Are we an early adopter accepting more risk for advantage or a careful follower? Those are legitimately different strategies and they demand different governance. A hospital and a social media startup should not govern AI the same way, and pretending there's one right answer helps nobody. A strategy sets objectives you can actually check against. In 12 months, every production AI system has a named owner and a current risk assessment. That's measurable. You'll know if you failed. And a strategy aligns with the business. This is the part governance people forget. If your governance strategy doesn't connect to what the business is trying to do, it becomes an obstacle they route around, and we're back to shadow AI. Here's how I'd frame it to leadership. Governance strategy isn't about how much AI risk we avoid. It's about what kind of AI organization we're choosing to be, and building the decision-making to match. Get that clear and the activities organize themselves. Skip it and you have busy work. So we covered appetite and tolerance conceptually back in chapter 3. Now let's make them into actual statements you can use, because this is where good intentions usually die. Recall the distinction. Appetite is strategic and broad. Tolerance is specific and measurable. Appetite is the philosophy. Tolerance is the tripwire. Here's what a real appetite statement looks like. We will not deploy AI as the sole decision maker in any case affecting a person's health, safety, or fundamental rights. That's a genuine line. It rules things out. You can hold a proposal against it and get a clear answer. And here's the tolerance that operationalizes it. For our fraud model, a false positive rate above a defined level triggers mandatory review, and above a higher level triggers automatic suspension. Notice that's actionable. A specific number, a specific consequence, no debate needed in the moment. Now, here's where organizations fail, and I've seen it repeatedly. They write beautiful appetite statements full of the word responsible, and they never translate them into a single tolerance. So, when a model starts degrading, nobody can say whether a line was crossed because no line was ever drawn as a number. So, my challenge to you, same one as before because it matters. For each significant model, can you state the number at which you halt it? If yes, you have tolerance. If it depends, you have a sentiment. Write the number down before you deploy. So let's talk about people. Because a governance framework without the humans to run it is just a wish with formatting. Here's the pattern I keep seeing. Organization commits to AI governance. Appoints one person, often part-time, usually borrowed from privacy or security where they already have a full job. Hands them a framework and is then puzzled when a year on there's a policy and very little else. That person never had a chance. So let's be honest about what governing AI actually requires in terms of capability. You need people who understand models. You need people who understand risk and law. And critically, you need someone who bridges the two, because those are rarely the same person and they don't naturally speak each other's language. That bridge role is the hardest to fill and the most valuable. You also need to think about the wider workforce, not just the governance team. The people building models need to understand risk. The people using AI outputs need to understand the limits. This is a training problem across the organization, not a hiring problem for one team. And here's the honest resourcing truth. The ongoing cost dwarfs the setup cost. Assessing a model once is cheap. Monitoring it for years is where the real effort goes, and it's exactly what business cases forget to fund. So the question for your sponsor, and I'll repeat it because it's the one that gets skipped. We funded building this. What have we funded for governing it over its whole life? So here's a reality that reshapes governance for most organizations. You probably don't build much of your AI, you buy it. And that changes where your risk lives. Think about how AI actually enters your organization. A vendor adds an AI feature to software you already use. You call an API from a large model provider. You buy a specialist tool with a model inside. You use an open source model somebody downloaded. In most organizations, that's the overwhelming majority of the AI footprint. And here's the accountability trap. People assume that if the vendor built it, the vendor owns the risk. Let me be blunt, they don't. And neither the regulator nor your affected customer will accept that framing. If you deploy a vendor's model to decide something about your customer, the harm is yours to answer for. So what does governing third-party AI require? You need to ask vendors real questions. What data trained this? How was it tested for bias? What can it not do? What happens when it fails? And you need it in the contract, not just the sales call. Here's the hard part, and I'll be honest about it. Vendors often won't tell you. It's proprietary, they say. And then you're accepting risk you cannot see. That itself is a governance decision, and it should be a conscious one made by someone with authority, not a default. So the principle: you can outsource the building, you cannot outsource the accountability. So NIST calls this one out specifically, Govern 1.1, and it's worth pausing on because it's foundational to everything else. The subcategory is about ensuring that legal and regulatory requirements involving AI are understood, managed, and documented. Sounds obvious. It isn't happening in most places. And here's why it's genuinely hard. First, the law is fragmented and moving. The EU AI Act, US state laws multiplying, sector regulators applying existing rules to AI, other jurisdictions all developing their own. If you operate across borders, you're tracking a moving target in multiple directions at once. Second, and this is the one people miss, existing law already applies to AI. You don't get a grace period. Anti-discrimination law applies to an AI hiring decision right now. Consumer protection law applies to an AI pricing decision right now. Data protection law applies today. Organizations wait for AI-specific regulation while breaching laws that already bind them. So what does Govern 1.1 actually ask of you? Know which laws apply to each system, given what it does and who it affects. Assign someone to track changes, because this field will not sit still. And document your reasoning, because when a regulator asks why you thought this was compliant, we followed a recognized process and recorded our analysis, is a defensible answer. We assumed it was fine is not. So the practical step. For each AI system, who owns knowing the law that governs it? If that name is blank, Govern 1.1 is not met. So let's finish Govern with the part you can't buy, can't mandate, and that determines whether everything else works. Culture. Here's why culture beats process. You cannot write a policy for every situation. AI throws up novel cases constantly. So in the gap between what the policy anticipated and what actually happened, what decides the outcome? Culture. What people do when there's no rule telling them what to do. Let me show you the two cultures. In a bad one, someone notices the model behaving oddly and says nothing. Why? Because raising it means work, or looks like criticism, or slows a launch someone senior wants. So the signal dies. And these signals, remember, the rising override rate, the odd output, the operator's unease, are your earliest warnings. A culture that suppresses them blinds you. In a good one, raising a concern is rewarded, not punished. The person who says, wait, something's wrong here, is thanked even when they turn out to be wrong because you want them to keep speaking. Psychological safety isn't a soft nicety here, it's a risk control. It's how problems reach you while they're still small. And culture is set at the top by what leaders actually do, not what they say. If leadership overrides governance whenever it's inconvenient, everyone learns governance is optional. So the question, in your organization, what happens to the person who raises an AI concern that slows things down? The answer tells you whether your governance is real. So let's gather up the govern function. First and above all, govern is cross-cutting, not sequential. It's the ground the other three functions stand on. Build it as a permanent condition, not a launch task you tick off. Second, everything here reduces to decision rights. Who decides and who answers? Avoid the two failure modes. Nobody owns it and everybody owns it. For each decision, there should be one name. Third, a policy is real only when it changes what someone does on a Tuesday and is wired into how work actually happens. If it changes nothing, it's a document. Fourth, you can outsource the building of AI, but never the accountability. Vendor risk is your risk. Fifth, existing law already applies. You're not waiting for regulation, you're likely already governed. And sixth, culture decides what happens in the gaps no policy anticipated. Reward the person who raises the concern. If you want a detailed, structured course on this topic, with role plays, quizzes, and practice tests, our Udemy course link is in the description. Do subscribe to the channel if this is helping, and the playlist link is in the description, giving you every video in the series in order. Next, we open the map function and learn how to understand a system before we build it. See you there.